Space? Makes you think of alien worlds? Far away from us and our daily lives. Are you sure? Let's take a closer look. A large number of satellites orbit Earth today, with many different functions. Navigation, communications, time synchronization, and the observation of our planet. Too abstract? Okay. What would a day without space systems look like? Without GPS or Galileo satellites, our mobility would be severely limited. Navigation systems would not work. And public transport? Without reliable satellite data, there would be chaos. The global transport of people and goods by land, sea, and air would be seriously affected. Our increasingly decentralized energy supply would become impossible to synchronize without the time signals from satellites. Entire power grids would become unstable. The result? Breakdowns and blackouts with unpredictable consequences for the economy and society. We are also dependent on reliable communication. This would not be feasible without space infrastructure. That includes communication with friends and family. News, live broadcasts, radio reception, reliable sources of information. Everything would be greatly limited, throwing us all back into a long-gone age of communication. The police, fire brigades, relief services, and armed forces would lack the infrastructure to communicate without interference and to precisely determine location. Critical time would be lost in situations where assistance is required. Withdrawing cash at ATMs? Impossible without time synchronization by satellites. Money transfers, share purchases, credit transactions, everything is frozen without a timestamp. The financial markets would be on the brink of collapse. Uncertainty and chaos would loom. Weather forecasts would no longer be possible, not even for fire brigades and civil protection. There would be no more sowing, crop care, or harvesting support for agriculture. Harvest forecasts? No longer possible. We would sorely miss the insights from our Earth observation satellites, and not just in the fight against climate change. Information about environmental degradation, melting ice masses, polluted oceans, cleared forests, vegetation, methane, carbon dioxide, and ozone would also be lost. But the importance of space goes further still. Space activities are projects for all of humankind, across national borders. The extraordinary can only be achieved through international cooperation. Space drives innovation. Space exploration inspires development and is a catalyst for the creation of new technologies. Space travel is about curiosity, crossing borders, and expanding knowledge. We look to the future. We search for the origins of life. But we must also take care of ourselves and our planet. The preservation and protection of our space infrastructure is crucial, and it will become essential for humanity in the future.
And welcome to Scotty, Who Owns Space on MSC Townhall. Great to have you with us here in the room and virtually. I'm Jean Meserve. I am a member of the Homeland Security Experts Group, a member of the board of the Space Foundation. I also co-host the Spy Talk podcast. This is a really exciting time in space. It's also a transformational time in space from a science perspective, from a business perspective, and from a military and geopolitical perspective. Not only have we seen the successful launch of the James Webb Space Telescope, which is going to give us unprecedented images peering back to the early years of the universe, we've also seen an unprecedented burst of launches from an unprecedented number of space players. We've seen a growth of investment in the space sector. We've seen the birth of space tourism, and we have seen a lot of activity in space, which, if not military, is at the very least dual use. So we're going to be talking about all those aspects of space here today with our distinguished panel. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? But before we begin our discussion here, I'm going to turn things over to Will Marshall. He's CEO of Planet. You're going to set the stage for us. Go to it, Will.
Yeah, it's my job to just set a little bit of the stage. I'm Will Marshall, CEO of Planet, and we operate 200 satellites doing Earth imaging. They image the whole Earth every day. So in terms of context, I think a lot of people are seeing that space is undergoing a renaissance. We're hearing about the new rockets, space tourists, as you've mentioned. But I think the most important upshot of what's going on is a data revolution. It's about data and AI and the applications, not for the moon or Mars, but for the Earth. And let me just tell you a few things about what's underpinning that, why it matters, and I'll give you a couple of examples on some slides. So what's underpinning that is we've had reusable rockets that have decreased launch costs by about 4x. We've had a increase in cost performance of satellites about 1,000x over the last 5 years, which is a dramatic change. It's like the mainframe computer to desktop transition of the IT, and it's unleashing new capabilities. And then there's AI that enables us to extract value out of that. Let me just mention two capabilities that are coming out of this. We are now, as compared with 5 years ago, producing more than 10 times more imagery about the Earth than we did 5 years ago. And in terms of communication satellites, we're producing and transporting 10 times more data around the planet with constellations like OneWeb and Starlink. And so this really is a data revolution. So why does this matter? I think it matters for 3 reasons. One is the economy. It's powering the digital transformation of major industries. The second is in sustainability. So we all need to move to a sustainable economy. All the governments need to measure their sustainable development goals. All the companies need to measure their ESG targets. And satellite data is pretty much the source that underpins all of that. And then in security. You might think, what's space got to do with security? Well, it's a lot. And of course, we're here in Munich, and that's what we're here to discuss. What's happening is we're bringing about a transformative disruption in transparency of what's going on the planet. Basically, like our daily scan of the planet is showing up new issues and events around the Earth, and everyone's getting to see. It went from something that just the superpowers could look at to now something that everyone can see. And so let's just put that into a couple of perspective with a couple of these examples. So on these slides, if we can start again, you're here. This is the end of it, but we can start at the beginning. Maybe you could just cycle. This is a satellite picture we took just yesterday of this very place. But so we're, of course, discussing Ukraine. This is an image we showed and shared with the New York Times. And press is bringing and using this imagery to shed light on world events. This just over 2 days this week, from 14th to the 15th, a new bridge was constructed between Belarus and Ukraine, enabling troops across that border. Here's the development and change of a significant new troop on the Russian-Ukraine border. Of course, the question is, does it change the calculus of political leaders if they know that this is all going to be in the public domain and everyone's going to see their activities? Sometimes they use it, sometimes they don't want it to be there, and I think it's going to change the political calculus. We also, of course, this last year saw the chaotic removal of troops from Afghanistan, and we were helping those efforts of trying to safely remove civilians. This is civilians shown there on the tarmac of the Kabul airport. There's just 1 or 2 more examples in this slide deck, mainly in China, where this last year we exposed 100 nuclear missile silos that were previously undisclosed, and then this, where some amazing journalists did some work looking and finding 200 Uyghur detention camps across China. And for that work, they won the Pulitzer Prize. And here's a little video showing the buildup of one of those camps. So just a few examples of how satellite imagery is bringing transparency to world events. And I think that as we arrive here in Munich, I guess this is not playing, but there's a video of this train coming into the Munich station. Just imagine it's moving, because we have video as well. But as we arrive here in Munich, the question is, how does that change the political calculus? Would it have changed Xi Jinping's calculus if he knew that those Uyghur detention camps were going to be exposed? Would it change Putin's calculus if, for example, he's trying to create pretext for an invasion into Ukraine if he knows that it's all going to be live for everyone to see? So that's the question I'll kick this thing off with.
Well, thank you so much, and hopefully our space technology is working better than our terrestrial technology here.
Fine, it's fine.
We're now going to introduce this great panel. First, remotely, we have with us Pamela Melroy. Pam, are you there? We want to see your picture. There you are. Hello. Deputy Minister of NASA joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for being here. And please don't hesitate to chime in, even though you're not physically in our space. Thank you, satellites, for bringing you to us. Now let me introduce the rest of the panel. Also with us is Dirk Zemper, who is Executive Board Representative for Defense and Security with the German Aerospace Center. Also with us, a familiar face, General David Petraeus, former CIA Director and now Chairman of KKR Global Institute. Will, we have just met, of course. Also with us, Soren Dekaru, who is Director of the European Satellite Center. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Joseph Aschbacher. See, my German is getting better. Who is, of course, Director General of the European Space Agency. Thank you all for being with here. So the question posed in the title tonight was, who owns space? So I want to do a round robin and ask each one of you, who owns space? Pam, I don't want to put you on the spot, but to make sure you're included in this, do you want to take that first?
Yes. Well, I just want to say how excited I am to join you, and thanks to the Munich Security Conference for seeing the growing importance of space in geopolitics and defense. And I also want to thank the host country, Germany, with whom we have a wonderful civil space relationship with DLR. Actually, really, when you're talking about these things, you always end up going back to the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which makes it very clear that no one country may take a part of space and claim it for themselves. So that is good, and it may also be difficult, to answer your question.
Okay. Dirk, do you want to go next? Who owns space?
I would say nobody and everybody at the same time, because it's right that nobody owns space, but when you have a look at what happens right now, if you populate an orbit and you have your satellites there, the orbit is yours.
Who owns?
Well, obviously, I violently agree with the experts. I mean, I did go back and read the Outer Space Treaty, from 1967, but I want to answer a more prominent question, I think, in the minds of people here, and that is, what in the world is a former infantryman, paratrooper, combat commander doing here on a space panel? And let me explain it to you. Again, just as this movie did up front, the video did, it explained how reliant we are on all this. And when I was preparing for this, I thought back about that. And we are incredibly reliant. All of our vehicles have GPS trackers on them. That's how we avoid shooting our own forces. Our bombs have GPS devices that home in and produce really accurate stuff. Our drones are not piloted by people out in Iraq and Afghanistan other than for taking off. I remember going to see the guys who took them off, and then I realized you've handed it off. Where is it? Where are they flown? An Air Force base is publicly known, Creech Air Force Base outside Las Vegas, Nevada. Bounced off 2 satellites when we were in Afghanistan, only 1 satellite from Iraq. Our communications, many of them were satellite, our best communications, because it's obviously much more than line of sight or high frequency. And it just goes on and on. And so I ended up saying in those days, no commander ever had enough troops, money, or bandwidth. And that really, the most precious bandwidth was 25 megahertz chips or segments on a satellite. And we were fighting over those from the day that we invaded Iraq when I was a 2-star. And there were only a few of those available by final 4-star commands in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we were constantly allocating shortages. That's how precious these assets are. And that has just gotten more and more and more. And hats off to Will, and also Robert Cardillo, who is back here, I think, the former NGA head director back in the day, and for all that they did to support guys like me, and really, more importantly, the individuals I was privileged to lead.
And the answer to the question, who owns space?
Everyone and no one.
Or ditto, I think the Outer Space Treaty makes it clear no country owns it.
Right.
So it's a pretty open shut case in that sense. And of course, many people use it. And as you say, you can jam up an orbit and therefore de facto sort of own it. But that's only in geostationary. Generally, it's everyone's game.
Soren?
Well, let me continue where John Barturos left it, because he made a point of how much we are reliant on outer space. And I would say, also on the other space, the digital space, the cyberspace, because sensors in space plus the data will link together. So to respond to the question is yes, sovereignty cannot be claimed, but if we are so reliant on space, if something goes wrong and there's a problem, we own the problem. So maybe we should put the question the other way around. Scotty, who cares about space? And we should all care about space. And I think we do, because otherwise we are not where we are supposed to be. So the fourth industrial revolutions and probably all the others that will follow will depend on space and cyberspace.
Jose?
So who owns space? I think it was already said. I mean, first of all, hello to Pam over there. I think very nice to see you. No. But as we have seen in this movie before, we depend so much on space for all things in life. And I think this makes us realize that it's such an important question that we really need to debate this, and that's what we exactly do here. So who owns space? I'm not a lawyer, but the Outer Space Treaty, lawyers have really been contemplating a lot of who owns space and what are the rules of governing it. And as I'm sure you know, when the Space Treaty was defined and discussed and finally agreed in 1967, what they used is something that is also used in the Arctic, for example, and it's called res communis. We Europeans love Latin terms. So res communis means it's something that is owned by everyone, and there's a very small caveat to it, which means on the basis of equality and under respect of international law. And I think this is the best definition I can give. It's not given by me. This is given by lawyers as a basis for the Outer Space Treaty, and I think that still is valid.
So if no one owns it, no one controls it. Soren, what are the implications of that?
Well, many of the applications have been already highlighted. Everything, pretty much everything of our life, economy, social life depends on space. Security depends a lot. I'm involved with the Satellite Center in providing security from space through the analysis of images, but also providing security in space through the Space Surveillance and Tracking Consortium.
But I'm trying to get at sort of what's been termed the Wild West aspect of this, that there are so many players out there and there are so many objects out there, and if nobody owns it, who controls it? Well,
there are some rules. There is liability convention, I think of 72. There is a registration convention of 75. There are rules that are developed on the way. For example, the United Nations Convention on the, United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space has started, especially since 2019, work in this direction. So there is an effort, but I think we are far from where we should be, because with the dynamic of technological development, with the congestion in space, we need to invest more in what would be sustainability, safety, and security. And by the way, the European Union has launched a couple of years ago a public diplomacy initiative, the so-called 3 SOS, sustainability, security, and safety in outer space, 3 times SOS because it's urgent. I think it has to be pushed also from ground roots upwards, and also it has to be developed between governments as well. So we have to have a double approach, governmental but also non-governmental.
Things have changed a lot since 1967. Do we need new rules?
Yeah, I think we do. I certainly think that, I think it's a fantastic foundation, but there's definitely areas where we could do more. I mean, we're sort of touching on it with space traffic management and managing orbits as they get more congested. I was mentioning earlier today that actually the biggest congestion factor isn't the satellites, it's the debris. And where does that come from? The biggest source of that these days is anti-satellite weapons. So the Russians recently did an anti-satellite test, blew up a satellite. That created far more pieces of objects in space. So I would appeal that we should have a ban on kinetic ASATs. I think that's better for everyone. So there's pieces still missing, but I think it's a solid foundation.
David,
Well,
is that
I'd like to-
realistic?
I'd like to-
Oh, Pam, go ahead. I'm sorry.
make a comment. Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to address here is the profound challenges of attribution. So I'll give you a very simple statistic. The volume of space from the surface of the Earth out to geosynchronous orbit, which is 36,000 kilometers, is equivalent to 240,000 times all of the oceans on Earth. And of course, there's probably been a session talking about subsea and submarines and things somewhere at the conference. It's really hard to find and detect things in that giant volume. We do have some capability for space surveillance, but the whole system is fraying at the seams. And it's really important to understand that attribution of activities and really understanding and going backwards and saying, okay, what caused that piece of debris to hit my satellite? Where did that debris originally come from? That attribution is an enormous challenge for us. We have to take that into account in any framework that we do.
General, I wanted to follow up, if I could, on Will's comment about anti-satellite weapons. And is it realistic that we would ever have an arms control treaty equivalent to nuclear agreements, nuclear accords in space?
I mean, it's certainly not impossible. Again, the question is, what is the good faith of those who would be most involved in this, and do you trust the others? I mean, it's the age-old.
Do you, by the way?
Not necessarily. No, what did Reagan say? Trust but verify, or something like that. And so that is the challenge, and it's always been the challenge. I mean, think of the struggles that we had just in arms control agreements between two countries with objects that were largely pretty verifiable. I mean, it's sort of hard to hide an ICBM silo. There's some things that can be certainly moved around, but here the challenge is enormous. I mean, it's not quite as bad as trying to legislate cyberspace, if you will, especially as more and more bad actors are out there. But it's an extraordinary challenge. It would have to be a huge gesture of very good faith by the leading countries, and whether or not, again, you could trust them. Let me ask the two who are in the business full time how they would respond to that. That's the issue.
But may I give the example of the nuclear test ban treaty, which I think is the best example, because once some of the players have proven that they can test a nuclear weapon, then they had an interest to converge on an agreement on test ban. I think we should be there on the ASAT.
Once we have it, of course, then nobody else can,
Well,
that's all of us agree.
This is how it worked in international politics,
certainly.
and I think we should take the example, because now some made the demonstration of ASAT weapons. Maybe it's time to have a moratorium.
And it's so negative for everyone when they happen.
Of course it is.
So,
Absolutely.
And actually, right now, I mean, when the Chinese recently did it, the US was in the UN saying, shouldn't do that. And the Chinese were like, well, you said it was okay because the US was blocking it in the UN, a treaty banning it. And so there's no tools to act if there's no treaty. If there's treaty, suddenly you can have tools. You can implement economic sanctions. So.
And I would contend, what I think is very valid is the time to do this is now before it proliferates again. I mean, the reason we occasionally were able to get some agreements on nuclear weapons is, number one, it's really hard to hide a nuclear explosion and a variety of other activities, but it's just a small number. Now it's getting more and more, and so if you're going to do it, you better do it pretty quickly.
I fully agree what David is saying. I think today we have a handful of countries who are capable of destroying a satellite out in orbit. And I think it's these handful of countries, I think, really need to get together and agree on it. And of course, when more countries might come or eventually could come, you have to watch very carefully what happens. But I mean, this is such a, it's really a huge problem. And just look at the sheer number of satellites that are being brought up to orbit. Between the very first satellite, 1957 Sputnik 1 or Sputnik, and 2019, we had the same number of satellites placed in orbit than in 2 years, in 20 and 21, which is enormous. And this is going not linear, but exponentially.
Yes.
So I think this is an urgent problem to solve. We cannot wait longer because it's happening and it's necessary right now. We have seen in the movie of DLR how important our life, how much we depend on it, and we cannot wait much longer. So I really urge those players who are placing satellites in orbit, who are having capability of possibly destroying one, to really get together and on a very practical case and just talk about it and take it serious.
Given the importance of the space domain to militaries now, is it realistic that we're going to see China and Russia agree to any sort of accord that would limit this kind of activity, Dirk?
Difficult question. I mean, they will definitely have the same issue as we have with the space debris they cause, because the space debris threatens their systems, threatens our systems. So at least from that perspective, hopefully I will have the same interests.
But if we come up with technology that could deal with the space debris, that would no longer be an incentive.
I mean, there is technology available that could handle it, but it's heavily expensive. I mean, for example, if you talk about a rover arm on a satellite going there, or laser technologies from the ground, it's heavily expensive and it's not going to work in the near future.
Let me put it the other way around. Why would they not be interested? They are depending on the orbits just as everyone else. Right. And I think that they have a very intrinsic interest themselves to make sure that there's some regulation or some rules that are being applied to which everyone adheres.
Are any negotiations taking place right now? Are these discussions taking place with the Russians and the Chinese?
They take place in the United Nations context.
In the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. And several countries, including
exactly that.
I think the EU, the UK, Canada, also Russia and China have all proposed bans on anti-kinetic anti-satellites. There's actually the US that has been blocking it.
Pam, the Artemis Accords have been proposed by the US. Tell us first just a little bit about what they are and how they might be useful in space.
Yeah, right. I'm glad you brought it up. It's really important. So NASA is a civil agency. We're not tasked with the defense of our satellites in space. But I would argue that we do have a very strong interest in these norms of behavior that we're discussing. So we definitely participate in the Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space and contribute discussions. And there have been ongoing discussions for the last decade on ways of reducing orbital debris. But as NASA and our international partners are laying in plans to return to the moon in preparation for human exploration to Mars in the next few decades, we're realizing that the things that we are doing actually are setting precedents. And we think it's incredibly important for us and our civil space partners around the world to contribute to norms and acknowledge that the things that we are doing are setting precedents. And so we developed the Artemis Accords in conjunction with our partners. They're a set of 13 provisions. They are an extension of the Outer Space Treaty, and it's essentially a framework for sustainable human exploration of the moon and other celestial bodies. And we now have many partners: Australia, Brazil, Canada, Israel, Italy, Japan, Mexico, Luxembourg, New Zealand, Poland, South Korea, Ukraine, UAE, UK have all signed along with us. And we think it's a step in the right direction for norms that is very applicable to what we're doing.
Dirk, have the Germans signed on?
I'm not aware. I just do not know. So
Not
Italy
not
and Luxembourg
yet, but
from
we're
Europe.
hoping.
And what about ESA?
No, we have 22 member states, and they individually sign up or don't. I can tell you there's quite a bit of debate. Some of them, was just mentioned, 2 of them have signed up, the others not, but it's their choice.
Is there something they don't like about the Artemis Accords that are keeping them from signing on?
Oh, you have to ask them. I cannot tell you. I mean, this is for the individual countries to decide. I think it is probably a question of to what extent you define a new set of rules. We have mentioned before there's the Outer Space Treaty, and of course this would be an evolution or some kind of evolution. And I think there's not a consensus yet, at least among the ESA member states.
Will the Artemis Accords, as I understand it, deal with countries? What about the commercial sector?
Well, all of the space treaties...
Don't there need to be rules and regulations for
Absolutely. I mean, the way the space treaties are written, it's all for nation states, but it sort of proxies that to any country's companies in any country are subject to them via the state, essentially. So it's same, but I do think that the future space law needs to be developed in conjunction with commercial actors. It's not just a national affair anymore, and so it would benefit from commercial input. And I think one of the things that's, the Artemis Accords are starting to get towards, and we need to have a whole discussion around, is things like space property rights. So when we get to the moon, which is a near-term prospect, who owns what? Under the Outer Space Treaty, no one can own bits of the moon. Or no sovereign country can own, and therefore, by proxy, companies
can't claim it either.
And they can't claim it, and they can't put a military base on it. But it's like, what if they take some lunar regolith out of the soil or some water from the poles? I was involved with a spacecraft we sent to the moon, found lots of water on the pole of the moon. That's going to be the place that everyone wants to go. If they take that water and then drink it, can they drink it? Or I don't know, like exactly what happens. They might have to share it. Who knows? But anyway, all of this is like really unwritten territory as so far. If you look at the law of the seas, there's like this much law, and if you look at the law of the land, it's sky high, and if you look at the law of space, it's like this much. So we haven't dealt with a lot of the problems that are going to come up, and it's not so far off. I mean, a lot of this sounds very far-fetched, but we're having private missions going to the moon now, and so we might see this starting to become important. The Artemis Accords, at least, is a starting point in that sort of discussion, at least.
Several of you have mentioned space debris, obviously a huge problem. If we don't find a way to get a handle on that problem, is it going to destroy the space boom that we're currently involved in? Would it slow it down?
Space is still very big, as we were earlier sort of describing.
It's huge.
And
as a business.
And there are means of economically removing it, but the main thing is to curtail the big development of new pieces of debris from things like ASATs, and then I think we'll be able to get a handle on it. Just like the environment, the sooner you nip it in the bud, the better.
So Russia and China clearly have been growing their military space capabilities. David, which capabilities are they developing that concern you the most?
Where do you begin? One that is particularly concerning is the Chinese version of their own GPS system, which makes you realize that they don't intend to rely on ours forever. They want to have their own, and makes you realize that they could do without ours.
Which means they could take ours out.
In some way, yeah. I mean, there's various critical paths or critical nodes that you could target. And again, mentioned cyberspace is a key element of all this as well. By the way, this is, again, not unlike cyberspace. Who's going to agree on that? Except it's so many more actors and players in it. But again, look, the ASAT system is hugely concerning. It's very, very dangerous. And that action by Russia, again, you want to undermine trust and everything else, just do that. So again, there's a whole host of these different capabilities that are up there. And again, many of them duplicate what we have. And they enable certain activities that we know are very, very precious to us. We'd sort of like to be the only ones that have them, as always. But life just doesn't work that way.
Sorry?
Well, I think from a security background, I will categorize three dimensions in terms of the graveness of impact. Of course, first would be ASAT, we discussed, because they're so destabilizing, they generate debris in all directions. But the next level is also quite destabilizing when we speak about the jamming, the spoofing, electromagnetic attacks or cyber attacks. Why? Because they could completely derail the proper functioning for our GPS, plane flights or military operations that rely on these kinds of. They can generate huge casualties and really catastrophic consequences. So that would be another layer that needs to be addressed. And then there's the other layer, like the spying and so on, which practically is not spying, not regulated anyway in international law, and that will probably continue. We'll see some analysts consider spying having a stabilizing effect because it avoids misinterpretation of an enemy. But I think on the first two layers, we need to do a special effort in the upcoming years because they are hugely destabilizing.
I want to get to audience questions in just a moment, but Will, I know you want to chime in on that.
Well, I think the third point you were going to say is really actually the more interesting thing. We're talking about security in space. I think the more interesting discussion is security that's happening on Earth because of space, and you're sort of hinting at that. I mean, I think, again, per my introductory remarks, the transparency that Earth imaging is providing is a net positive for peace and security because everyone's going to see each other's actions. And I think that generally reduces tension and increases stability as opposed to not knowing anything until the troops are right up in your...
Oh, that's not working in Ukraine, however.
Well, I think it's helping.
Well, I think it's helpful.
I think it's very much helpful.
Very much so.
Yeah.
May I jump in just to avoid...
But certainly, Mr. Putin is not afraid of having the satellites see what he's doing.
He's playing it,
yes,
even,
exactly.
arguably, but it's definitely, I would say it's still stabilizing.
Oh, I think it's very hard to argue with an image.
Just to avoid a misunderstanding, when I was speaking of the satellite spying, I was speaking about the shadow satellites. We'll hear stories and so on that are happening, and that will continue to happen. Earth observation now en masse, I see it not as it's transparency, like you mentioned it. It allows to see what happens, and that's the way we're living in. There's not that's part of our broad situational awareness. So just wanted to make sure that there's no misunderstanding. So I was speaking about the shadow satellites, spying one satellite against another.
Got it.
Can I just ask you, David? Do you agree with that? I mean, do you think it's a stabilizing impact on the world to have more information about what everyone's doing?
I certainly think sharing commercial imagery is a stabilizer. I'm not about to share what Robert, assuming that we do that.
Although some of their imagery, I understand, is now being handed over to academics to help with analysis. Am I right?
Not without a little bit of fuzzing up.
This is a town hall.
That said, the resolution of commercial imagery, it's been allowed to get better and better and better. There are still limits on it, as you know, and no one really knows how good it really can be. But again, no, I think it's fantastic to see what's going on in Russia laid out for the world to see.
This is a town hall meeting, and I would love to take some questions from our audience. We have some microphones. Does anybody want to chime in here? Don't be shy. I know we have people with strong opinions in the room.
I mean, anybody who stayed up till 10 o'clock
to
discuss space clearly has to have questions.
Or they
hope that there was beer here. I don't know.
Okay, I see a. Oh, there we go. And name and organization, please. I think it's probably on.
It's on? Okay. Hi, it's Christoph from German Aerospace Center as well. When we talked about transparency, we talk about we have to attribute what is going on in space. So what are the political, commercial means or research means to enhance those capabilities in the future to make it then probably for all of us more safe in space?
Yeah. I mean, there are several things. Of course, one thing is the transparency, which we just mentioned, and I think this is great. I mean, all our satellite data we provide are enormously helpful because people know what's going on. But I think you should also think of other means of keeping your orbits clean. And I see the orbits a bit like what we have been debating for decades on the Earth now with climate change, sustainability, make sure that we care about our planet, that we have a future down on Earth. The same on space. We have to see our space orbits also as a sustainable resource or a place where you need to apply sustainability. So therefore, you need to clean them up, you need to keep them clean and make sure that even debris which are there can be removed. Yeah. So there is certainly the circular economy which has to be enhanced with refueling, in-orbit servicing, so to make sure that the spacecraft live as long as possible. Then active removal of debris from space to really take a big chunk of space and get it down further and burn it up. And obviously avoiding all elements that are creating debris. What we really would like to promote is what we call a net zero debris balance. That means not adding debris in the future, but if you do so, have to take one out or make sure that one goes out. There are different ways of doing that. And I think that's what we need to end up doing, because otherwise we just clog it up and at some point it's too dense and cannot be properly used anymore. And there are different ways how you can do that. I don't want to go too deep into these details, but I think this is something what we have to aim for.
And just from a research perspective, I mean, that's where we can offer technology solutions, you know, for that. I mean, you can think about what kind of deorbiting technology you need to bring on the satellite to deorbit it when the lifetime is over, or other technologies that you can maybe use from the ground to deorbit a system. So there we have solutions available. It's just how we implement it and how we make it. Yeah. Let's put it that way, a rule that you deorbit your system.
Today we have we have more dead satellites in orbit than live satellites,
right.
And that of course is a problem, because the dead satellites, so the ones at the end of their life, some of them still have fuel on board. The heat exposure to the sun and the night makes tanks explode or makes them collide. And of course, this is a huge problem. And I think there we have really to make an effort to start cleaning up.
And these planet satellites, which are awesome, to my knowledge, do not have a deorbital feature on them, do they?
Well, they do in the sense that they fly with it's long technical discussion.
So how
Are you a
they come down
responsible
in
space
a few
citizen?
weeks or months.
Okay.
How long are they going to stay in orbit after service?
After service, a couple of months. Yeah, because they fly like this, and then they get a lot of drag.
Pam, I know you want to chime in.
Yeah, I did want to chime in because there are the orbital debris standard mitigation practices, which have been adopted by most countries in their space laws. And one of the things that's important to remember about LEO, where Planet operates, is that amazingly Mother Earth does in fact have a cleansing system, and it's that items have drag and eventually deorbit into the Earth's atmosphere. So far, we don't have the same orbital debris problem in GEO that we do, but it's beginning to grow, and that's a much worse issue because we're talking never, or basically millions of years, if at all, for deorbit. So I think there's another point too about the debris in LEO. I think we really are struggling a little bit with the technology. Yes, you can go pick up a big dead satellite and help it deorbit, but in fact, there's a bunch of debris that is big enough to hurt a satellite, but too small for our current space situational awareness systems to track. And so when I think of technology, there is a growth of commercial SSA companies, and I think they're going to help us. And that's really important because you can't avoid an impact if you don't even see it coming. If they're two big objects, you can actually see it coming.
So beyond the debris issue and the necessity to develop technology to make the space safer, I want to point to at least two domains where technology will push us forward, and it's both the technology related to the sensors, to the satellites, be they electro-optical or synthetic aperture radar, and I'm not speaking just about resolution, but also the time resolution, the possibility to revisit. So there's one aspect, and the other aspect is technology to develop the data management that comes from these sensors. And that's another fascinating domain because some data will be processed at the source, at the origin, some at the ground stations, and some at the user with a lot of use of artificial intelligence, algorithm, and so on. So these are the two key areas that we need to have in mind. And to me, there's a gold rush actually happening in outer space and cyberspace technology. This is pushing economies forward, and it's really attracting our imagination for what's possible the next day. It's fascinating.
I think we had another question over here. I recognize you.
So Mike Rogers, retired admiral in the U.S. Navy, was the U.S. Navy's commander for space when I was a 3-star, and then as a 4-star partner with Robert, I was interested in the SIGINT uses of space. 20 years ago, if you look at on orbit, what was up there, it was largely predominantly governmental, whether that be military or other. Fast forward, the commercial sector is really driving it in the commercial world. The mechanisms we had initially created for situational awareness and coordination in space were largely governmental/military. Has the coordination and the situational awareness mechanisms that we have in place, are they maximized for the world we live in now, where the greatest actors up there in just terms of volume? It's not governments anymore, it's the commercial sector. Just curiosity question.
Yeah, yes, I think it's evolving, and it's evolving very fast. There are places like Leo Labs and others that are evolving to track debris better. There isn't the same level of coordination. Joseph mentioned earlier in a time when one of his satellites was on course to collide with one of the Starlink satellites, and there wasn't the communication channels in place. It's not that they both didn't want to do the right thing. One of the things that also Starlink constantly maneuver their satellites with slow propulsion. That makes it almost impossible to predict where they're going to be. They're not doing that on purpose to be evasive. They're just doing that because of the nature of how they did their ConOps or the operations of their satellites. But I think these systems are rapidly evolving because everyone's interest is totally aligned. But you're right. I mean, half the satellites in orbit, roughly, I think, are planets and Starlink. So, I mean, and that's just 2 of the many companies. And so the vast majority of satellites these days are commercial, for sure. And so we have to be part of the discussion for sorting out conjunctions and collisions. But remember, again, most of the objects aren't satellites. There's more dead satellites than satellites, and then there's about 100 million pieces of space debris orbiting the Earth, most of which we can't see at all, per the earlier point. And so that's still dangerous, especially to our dinky little satellites.
Joseph, did you want to weigh in on that at all? The tracking?
No, I think it's really the fact that we have so many debris. You mentioned a few 100 million, which is the very small one, but they are like a bullet. And then you have, the size of tennis ball, you have about 30,000 of those, and they are tracked, thank God, because they are large enough so you can track them, and we are very grateful to the US really to provide this service globally and to us as well and to many other partners because we do need this information. So yes, first of all, we do need this information, and secondly, we need to be able to also track smaller ones because they're just as dangerous, if not even more, because they are like a bullet. They're very fast, and of course, they can destroy the electronics and the satellites.
Do we have another question out there? Yes.
Yes, hi, Victor. I work in the private sector. M&A transactions mostly, a little bit, but I love space. And the question I have right now, the panel was called Who Owns Space? And my argument would be it's machines. Do we need more humans in space at all?
Provocative. We were talking about the goals that ESA had in space. There was some talk of humans there.
I mean, do we need more humans? I think this is, okay, first and foremost, there are many more machines out there than humans. This is very clear. And I'm looking a bit at Pam, with whom we have a fantastic...
Who has been a human in space, by the way.
She's neutral in this.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, we have astronauts there. But as always, if you do exploration, you send machines to first explore what's out there. At some point, you need to send humans because you can never, ever replace a human with a machine, as clever as these machines may be. So yes, there will be human exploration that will increase and probably at a certain rate, not as fast as robotic exploration. We need both. It's not one or the other. And yes, of course, we do need humans in space because I always, when I talk to astronauts, when they come back from a space mission, and I ask everyone the same question, I said, what did impress you most? And they said, look, when I'm at the space station and I look out this window, seeing our little Earth, the curvature of it, a very thin atmosphere, this makes me realize that we are so fragile, so beautiful, but so fragile, and we have to protect this very planet. There's no other one, at least for a long period of time, where we can live. So yes, we do need humans out there, in addition to machines.
Pam, give us your perspective, if you would.
Oh, yeah, I'll pile on there. First, I just want to follow up on Joseph's point about what you see from space. it's not just the fragility of our planet, but the recognition that it's very difficult to see boundaries. You don't see countries, you see the Earth, you see mountains and oceans and weather systems. And the perspective I think that most people who have flown in space have is that this is our spaceship and we are its crew. So the space perspective is inherently international and it's global. I'd like to address the science issue as well. We built the International Space Station because we knew that we could be hugely productive with our partners, European Space Agency, Canada, Japan, Russia. We have incredibly important partnerships with them, but we are all doing science together in space. And we're not there yet with artificial intelligence. You can tailor AI to solve a specific problem. You cannot develop an AI system that can solve 3 or 4 problems at once. One of my favorite examples of this is recently our Mars rover, the Perseverance rover, which is taking samples in a place that we think is most likely to have had life in the past on Mars. And it was a sandy sample. And it took us like 3 days to figure out that the sand had all leaked out. And I promise you, if a person had been there, they would know right away that they had not gotten that sample, and they would have gotten another sample right away. We absolutely need our robotic exploration to burn down risk, to tell us where humans could be most effective and most valuable. But eventually, to really be productive in science, you have to send people.
Pam, let me just follow up. You mentioned partnership and how the space station has been fantastic for that. So the space station is going to be retired in a few years. What happens to cooperation and collaboration in space when it is no longer there?
Well, the beautiful thing about that is that we learned so much. Some people in the room probably know this, the International Space Station joint program around the world has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize a few times. And I think it's really valid. We've learned how to work together in space, to build things, to operate them, to partner, to share our science and act as a team together. We are taking that to the next step. So in our Artemis program, our very first mission back to the moon with the most powerful rocket ever built sometime this spring, carrying on board a partnership between the German Space Agency and Israel, a scientific experiment to look at the effects of radiation. And Europe is a critical partner in the Artemis program. They're providing the service module for our crewed vehicle. And we have partnerships with many other countries. And we're starting to extend it beyond just the partners we have with ISS. So I think we're just building. We're just building on it.
And that will continue even once the space station is retired, in your opinion?
You bet. We won't do it any other way anymore.
Okay.
Russia.
Oh, everybody wants to weigh in here. David, I'll start.
Well, when does Russia return, Pam?
Well, we have a wonderful working relationship with them. I have flown with cosmonauts. I've trained in Russia. The most extraordinary thing about that relationship is how dedicated we all are to space, to safety, to human space flight, and to science. And it's a shining star right now. And these things are actually very important. You have to have the lines of communication open. We humbly acknowledge the role of our partnership in the stability in the relationship, even when everything else is really tough. We are actively talking to Russia and about what the next steps are in the future. They are thinking about the same subjects as we are. What's the next step after ISS?
Will?
Yeah, I was just going to pile on this point that we do need, as someone that puts up machines into space, I think the human eye is fantastic. It brings a totally different lens, this overview effect. They say when we went to the moon, we discovered the Earth. Of course, we knew we were on a fragile planet, but that view cemented it in all of our imaginations in a totally different way. And so I think we need it. And then just on this international cooperation point, I just want to bring people back to when the ISS began. Really early on, it was before the end of the Cold War, and the first project of collaboration between Russia and the US was the Apollo-Soyuz that then led to the International Space Station, essentially. There was space cooperation long before there was cooperation in almost any other domain. Space has often been the place where it almost has risen above. I mean, the Russians have been launching US astronauts to the International Space Station through thick and thin. And I actually think space can be a symbol of cooperation through hard times. And I say a lot of people will say it's crazy, but I think the US and China should work together on human spaceflight because there needs to be a place that is not considered a conflict zone, and that they're cooperating, and that'll actually lead to a lot of benefits. A lot of people would disagree with me, so
yeah, currently prohibited.
It's currently prohibited, exactly.
I think we have time for one more question. Do we have one out there? Yes, I see one back here.
So thank you very much. Well, being a reserve soldier in my civilian life, I'm working for Airbus for the Space Data Highway project, and I see that we have a lot of technologies out there which would enable another major step, not so much in space, in the space segment, but predominantly on the sea segment, because you certainly remember the disappearing of the Malaysian aircraft, and also a lot of ships will are getting lost every year out in the oceans. Why don't we try to build a digital twin of all of the worldwide sea traffic, and having kind of a powerful data links from the space segment to all the ships, and keeping track of them, receiving the AIS signal, which is taking place already in parts, but we could even increase that, extending that to radar and merging radar and optical information. So we're doing I'm responsible for the Sentinel-1A, 1B, Sentinel-2, those satellites. I mean, they're also they're providing interesting information, but what I don't see is that all of those information sources are being put together, right? So we're all talking about big data, and this is another step which I see impending, and it's like a puzzle laying before us, but nobody puts it together. And this is what I would like to see.
David would love to answer this question.
There's an Israeli startup called Windward. I'm an investor in it. And it pulls everything together that it can get its hands on. It's founded by a big data analytics expert from Israel and a former maritime officer. And you'd be stunned at what comes off a ship. And when you put it all together, and you'd be stunned as well at how often people turn off the transponders. They can pattern all of this stuff. They can show where Iranians are, shipping weapons into Yemen, or North Koreans, where it's really quite extraordinary what they can do. There's a subset of that data that can come from space without question, because a lot of the transponders obviously all bounce up and back. But they're really quite extraordinary, and they're listed now on the London Stock Exchange. Yeah, they went public.
So work moving forward on that.
Yeah, they're just really quite well developed, and it keeps getting better, just like big data in everything.
So I'd love to do another round robin here to wrap things up. I'm wondering if we have enough redundancy and we have enough resiliency in our space infrastructure, given the myriad threats that we've discussed here tonight. Who wants to start that?
No. Remember what I said earlier. No,
Okay.
seriously. Again, as the most dedicated customer of this stuff, is the commander of the surge and commander of Afghanistan, we never had enough. We were always, as I said, allocating shortages. It's just like allocating unmanned aerial systems. You never have enough of those either. It's just really a huge shortage. So, the addition of what Will is doing and other companies are doing is really very, very valuable. It's a wonderful supplement.
So, and from a research perspective, I can add that this is an issue we are working on. I mean, there's no need to talk about the dependency on space-based assets and services. We have seen that, we talked about that. And we need, at least from a military perspective, responsive space capabilities to go there quick, to go with new capabilities there. And we are not there yet. So there's still something to do. We need to work on small satellites, sensors, quick integration, quick launch, and there's still a way to go. We need to work standardization. So when we talk space technologies, there are still some things that needs to work, and we are on that.
I mean, we have gone a long way by building up, I think, enormous monitoring capabilities. In fact, the Copernicus program is disseminating the largest volumes of data, 450 terabytes every single day to the community, and this is onward distributed. But we, as you say, we have still huge gaps. We are now developing what is called an accelerator on rapid and resilient crisis response, because if there is a crisis, and David knows very well, it takes some time until you get an image, and to get a good image and the right image, and this has to be almost instant, and there we still have huge gaps to close, and not only the imaging, but also the processing of information in space with artificial intelligence, with what is called cognitive cloud computing, and interconnection of satellites, that they reprogram themselves in order to look at the same spots and get information down to the one who needs it. There's a lot to be done. I think we have the technology in place, most of it, but we need to really put it together and have a larger volume of it. There's no way around it.
I think we're better on redundancy, and also has to do with a lot of industrial development, not so much on resilience. And this is why the accent on the accelerator is on resilience. So that's, to me, the key point at this point.
Will, you had the first statement. You get the last one. What do you think?
Well, I think we're just at the beginning of this space renaissance, and we will get more redundancy through that. But I think the most exciting piece that's going to happen in that is less the new satellites again, as much as the data interpretation. So we will see so much more downstream applications of what's being done upstream than we've currently seen, and so that's the exciting future. It's basically space data plus AI it's going to unleash huge potential. As redundancy per se, I think we've got enough for the most part. I mean, you'll say we need some more, but and there will be some more, but I think we've dealt with a lot of that, and now it's more about the applications.
Pam, I realized I didn't come to you for this last question. Redundancy, resiliency.
Well, I loved everybody's answers. I thought they were very relevant, but I'm just going to finish on a totally different note, because what's in my mind today is the resiliency and redundancy of infrastructure in cislunar space and on the moon. That's what we're thinking about, because if we want a permanent presence, a sustainable presence of humans extending out into the solar system for research and exploration, we're going to need even more infrastructure and resiliency and redundancy. So don't just think about it for the Earth, but beyond.
Mm-hmm. Pam Melroy, thank you so much for joining us from Washington, D.C. Also, thank you to the panelists here in Munich. Let me thank you all. Dr. Joseph Aschbacher, I'm getting so much better at that. I'm very proud of myself. Soren Dekaru, Will Taylor, General David Petraeus, and Dirk Zemper. Thank you all, and thank you all in the audience for staying up so late to be with us tonight. Appreciate it.